Hello and welcome back to another episode of Gamecom. Today we're going to take a look at Mortal Kombat from Midway in 1992. Here we're going to take a look at the original arcade version, and the reason why we're looking at this version is simple. Mortal Kombat has been ported to so many different other systems, but none of them have come close to how good the arcade version is. That being said, this game does have a few problems, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. First off, I just want to mention that this game is very influential, probably for all the wrong reasons. It was extremely famous and very controversial because of its, at the time, very intense and gory violence. However, one of the things that I think is actually quite funny when it comes to revisiting this game is how silly it is, actually. First of all, every time you punch someone or kick them in the face, it looks like there's like a lot of red jelly just exploding out of their head. It's really silly looking. But it was, it was controversial and it was very novel back in the early 90s. But me personally, I've always felt it was not that interesting. And yes, even for my 7-year-old self, when I saw this on holiday in December of 1992, I was actually more dazzled by the graphics. And I also thought the characters were really cool looking. The locations were so interesting. I mean, yes, a lot of the stuff is very like generic Asian locations, but to a 7-year-old mind, it was a completely different world. In fact, it took me a really long time to realize that Mortal Kombat 1 takes place on Earth in China, whereas Mortal Kombat 2 and many of the other Mortal Kombat games take place in different dimensions and stuff like that. But I really liked the characters for being what I thought was very unique. But I realize now that the characters are completely unoriginal, even for its time. In fact, more so for its time, because during the late 80s and early 90s, there were a lot of like American-made kung fu movies, starring actors such as Jean-Claude Van Damme. In fact, Johnny Cage, one of the characters in this game, is heavily inspired, almost blatantly ripped right out of one of Jean-Claude Van Damme's movies. Obviously, Liu Kang is a total ripoff of Bruce Lee. In fact, a lot of fighting games have their sort of Bruce Lee characters. Now, I promise you, check out Street Fighter 2. They have their own Bruce Lee knockoff character. I think his name is Fei Long. So, one thing that I really liked about this game, other than the graphics, is also its simple controls. I really liked the fact that it didn't stick to the 6-button layout that you see in Street Fighter 2, but it had a simple high punch, low punch, high kick, low kick, as opposed to Street Fighter's, light punch, medium punch, heavy punch, and light kick, medium you get the point. I also like that they assigned the block to its own dedicated button. That way you will use the block exactly when you need to use it without any confusion. I'm not saying that every fighting game needs a block that has its own dedicated button, but ultimately I really like the controls in MK1. However, one of the things that makes MK1 inferior to the more polished Mortal Kombat 2 would definitely be the gameplay. First of all, I think the jump arcs in this game are really, take a look at what I'm doing here. Liu Kang's all the way on the other side of the screen, but I can always reach him, and that's because the jump arcs are so massive. And to do a forward jump kick, you have to be really, really, really far away from your opponent. They fixed this in Mortal Kombat 2 because now you can just be, about 2 meters away from your opponent and your jump kick will make contact. Another thing I like about this game is how simple some of the fatalities can be. For instance, as you can see, I just did a simple uppercut and it did a pit fatality. In future Mortal Kombat games, especially starting with Mortal Kombat 2, you had to perform complex moves to do cockpit fatalities. The music in this game is average at best. It gets the job done, but Mortal Kombat is actually famous for having really awesome music, especially in 2 and 3. But this is the only arcade game that had synthesized music. The sequels would actually use real recorded stuff. But we're going to talk about those when we get to the sequels. But moving on. So, Mortal Kombat 1, again, I said it was very controversial for its time. And the reason why it was so controversial is because there really wasn't much of a rating system back in the early 90s. There were some attempts at a rating system, like Sega tried to create their own rating system for their games, but the rating systems weren't always very clear what the letters stood for and stuff like that. And so there was a whole court case about, how stuff like this shouldn't be marketed to children, and then eventually it led to the creation of the ESRB, which is the video game rating system in North America. So we can thank games like Mortal Kombat for doing that. But at the time, the creators of Mortal Kombat, John Tobias and Ed Boon, actually, they really were trying to market this game to kids. I mean, even their posters that promoted this game had, two kids playing one of their arcade cabinets, playing Mortal Kombat 1, and it's the one where Raiden and Kano, the two fighters from this game, comes out of the screen of the arcade cabinets and grabs the kids by the collar, and it's kind of stupid and foolish of John Tobias and Ed Boon for doing that, because if it weren't for that, Mortal Kombat wouldn't have been so prominent in the court cases that were happening at the time. That being said, I guess any silly game that has any form of violence back in the early 90s would have been criticized heavily regardless. I mean, for Pete's sake, Night Trap was criticized heavily, and it's the stupidest thing ever. It's so innocent. It's so dumb. Anyways, let's get back to Mortal Kombat. So, this game is heavily inspired by Big Trouble. What's it called? Big Trouble in Little China. I really don't understand why this movie is so prominent in terms of references. Mortal Kombat, obviously you have, Shang Tsung, who's this warrior that can shapeshift and stuff like that. He looks a lot like the villain in Big Trouble in Little China. But Raiden, he is completely ripped right out of the movie. There is another warrior wearing a big Chinese hat that can shoot lightning. It's insane. I was really surprised when I first watched that movie back in 2002. I was like, dude, that's Raiden. Anyways, but hey, you guys should totally watch that movie. It's actually really good. It's not deep. It's just stupid fun. It's just a really stellar movie. You should check it out. It's starring Kurt Russell. So as you can see, the aspect ratio is not exactly 4:3 or 16:9. It's sort of somewhere in between. And that's because I tried to find the correct aspect ratio of this game. Not all arcade games were at, the traditional 320x240. A lot of arcade cabinets, in fact, had some really strange resolutions. In fact, Mortal Kombat, I'm not sure if it's this one or the sequel, has a very strange refresh rate of like 54 hertz. Like, for those that don't know, televisions run at 60 hertz. And if it's in European regions, televisions run at 50 hertz. So trying to get this game to run perfectly on a computer using the MAME emulator is really difficult. Anyways, regardless of that, so sometimes you might see me just doing random things like punching randomly when I'm not even close to my opponent. That's because I'm trying to perform moves. The controls are not quite as good as other versions of Mortal Kombat. It is hard to get, like, Sub-Zero, for instance, to, shoot his ice ball or whatever it's called. But I am trying. As you can see, I am doing a fairly decent job at trying to take down my double here. So one of the things I love about this game is some of the elements I find to be really timeless. For instance, you don't really have an understanding of when this game takes place. You assume it takes place in 1992, but there really isn't anything giving it away of, when this game takes place. Another thing I really like about this game is the design of the game. Again, very strong Chinese feel to it, but at the same time, there's a fantasy element to it. Again, a lot like Big Trouble in Little China. But I also like the logo. The logo with the dragon? Funny thing is the logo was actually only finalized after they were already done developing this game. And the way I know this is because if you actually pay attention to the Mortal Kombat logo in the game itself, you'll see it's kind of less refined. It doesn't look as cool as the final version, but yet the arcade cabinet does have the final version of the logo. But if you guys want to check out some more stuff on the court cases that were going on with the controversial nature of games like Night Trap and Mortal Kombat, you should totally check out Gaming Historian. He did an episode on the ESRB. I will put a link in the description below. But yeah, so that's Mortal Kombat. It's okay. This is definitely the best version of the game. Like the Genesis and Super Nintendo, not nearly as good. Don't bother with those versions. I mean, gameplay wise they're okay, but I mean the best graphics and ironically the best sound is this original arcade version. However, when it comes to Mortal Kombat 2 and even Mortal Kombat 3, the ports that I think are the best of versions might surprise you.